And please, thank you. Please excuse me for children getting food in the background.
Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Geddard. I'm Community Programs Director at 1000 Friends of Wisconsin, and I don't think anybody should ever apologize for child noises in the background because I am pro-family, pro-kid. Anyway, we are 1000 Friends of Wisconsin. We are a land use and transportation organization specializing in land use and transportation, and we've been around since the mid-1990s doing just that across the state of Wisconsin. I just want to mention a couple of our programs that you might be interested in, and I will throw links in the chat when I'm done talking. One of them is Active Wisconsin, which is a group of advocates and community leaders across the state who want to make it easier to walk, bike, and take transit in their cities and towns. And we share resources and advocate at the state level. And I send out a newsletter every month that I think you will all enjoy. Another program we have is the Community Transportation Academy, which goes around the state. It's starting in just a few weeks in Kenosha, which I wanted to mention because our speaker grew up there. So the Academy is a free class for community members who want to learn more about local transportation planning so they can be more involved and more effective advocates for solutions that really work for everybody in their own community. And I will throw links to the chat about that as well. So I'm going to turn it back over to Carl to introduce our speaker and get us going. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right. So we are honored to have Matt Mleczko here with us today to talk about their research that they've done on exclusionary zoning. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in chat. We'll have a little bit of time to answer some of those questions at the end of Matt's presentation. Right now, I'll turn it over to Matt so that they can introduce themselves and start to pull up their research. And also, one thing that I do want to kick off with, if Matt can also talk a little bit about what exclusionary zoning is to help everyone get up to speed.
Great. Thanks, Carl. And thanks, Susan. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to be joining you. I am a postdoctoral associate at Rutgers University these days. And I'm just a few months removed from defending my dissertation at Princeton University, where I'm also affiliated with the eviction lab there. And that's where a lot of this work began. I'm grateful to 1000 Friends of Wisconsin for inviting me to share this work. One, because I'm really passionate about it and hopeful about the impact that it can have, but also because of my personal connection to the state and especially Milwaukee. As Susan said, I grew up in Kenosha, spent a lot of meaningful time in Milwaukee, from time at St. Ben's Community Meal. My first research job ever was at the Wisconsin Policy Forum back in the days when it was known as the Public Policy Forum. But most especially, I can trace back the roots of what I study, which is how housing policies and practices can help us move towards more equitably integrated communities. Because I, in my many experiences in Milwaukee, witnessed really high levels of inequity and segregation just walking around and driving around Milwaukee. And I wasn't a social scientist back then, but I can remember thinking just how unnatural all of the inequity and the segregation and the racialized poverty seemed. And of course, we have decades upon decades of research explaining just how all of these things are the results of policy decisions and financial and real estate practices. And so, that's a lot of what I'll be talking about today. And a lot of this includes exclusionary zoning. So that was what the title of this webinar is. Putting it simply, exclusionary zoning refers to the practice of not just zoning, but land use policies and regulations that make it really difficult, if not illegal or impossible, to build denser forms of housing that often include multifamily housing. So anything other than a single family house. And this almost always incorporates any kind of affordable housing you can think of. And so these are rules from everything from only allowing single family homes to mandating large lot sizes, mandating lots of parking spaces for every development, mandating low building heights, all things that, and there are many, many examples of it, but all of these things are policies that make it really difficult to build more dense forms of housing and less costly forms of housing, which drives up housing costs. So with that background, I'll jump into my research on the topic. And this is the cumulative exposure to exclusionary zoning in impoverished neighborhoods. So to set the stage, I'm going to start off with a finding from some related research in my dissertation, which gives you a portrait of what neighborhood integration in the US looks like in the metro US over the last 20 years. And so some findings that can be interpreted from this figure are, these are essentially grouping neighborhoods based on their trajectories over the last 20 years, whether they stayed segregated, were integrated, or moved towards integration and segregation. So some optimistic findings from this chart are that about 15% of neighborhoods in the metro US over the last 20 years were stably integrated, which is probably more than what most people might think. And of the neighborhoods that are moving in and out of these categories, the vast majority are actually moved towards integration in the last 20 years. But the less optimistic takeaway from this chart is that the vast majority of neighborhoods were stably segregated over the last 20 years. And there's a variety of reasons why segregation like this has been so stable and so persistent. The one I'm going to focus on today is exclusionary zoning. And I gave you a bit of an explanation of the definition, but I want to walk through an illustration of what that looks like on the ground, particularly in the Milwaukee metro area. So what I'm showing you here is a zoning map for one of the quadrants of Brookfield. And like most zoning maps, this is color-coded. So each color designates a different zoning district. The vast majority of what you see here is designated single-family zoning. So zones where only a single-family detached house is allowed. The red shading is, you can think of as commercial zoning. These darker, more bold yellow are where multifamily housing is allowed. And so the takeaway from this figure is the vast majority of residential land here is zoned for single-family zoning. And this maps on to where we might be able to find affordable housing or just more modestly priced housing. So if you go into apartments.com, this is as of last night, if I were a two-person household looking for an apartment at the fair market rent is something that the Department of Housing and Urban Development calculates for all metro areas. It's essentially what someone with a housing choice voucher is able to afford in a metro area. That level for a two-bedroom apartment is $1,170 in the Milwaukee metro area. And there's a grand total of 0 of those apartments available in the Brookfield area. Now, a lot of what I'll be talking about in this webinar is about suburban and central city exclusionary dynamics, but it's not just a suburban exclusion story. Even within cities, we can have neighborhoods that are more restrictively zoned and make it more difficult to access housing in different parts of the city. And just as Brookfield is much more white and much more affluent than the city of Milwaukee, there are more white and affluent neighborhoods within Milwaukee where housing is also more difficult to access. So as, for example, John Johnson at Marquette has pointed out, neighborhoods like Washington Heights is one such example. And that's sort of over in this area where the area is zoned essentially for single family and duplex housing. When we look for the same exact apartment, the two-bedroom at or below $1,170 per month, again, none of those apartments are available in this area of the city. And so this is just a illustration of why we might care about exclusionary zoning, how it maps onto very realistic housing search problems for folks when trying to locate housing that's affordable to them. And many of you probably have heard of exclusionary zoning before logging on today. It's something that has gotten a lot of attention in the national media and policy discourse in outlets like the New York Times. Cities are increasingly turning to their zoning and land use codes to try to address issues of housing affordability and segregation, perhaps most notably in Minneapolis, but states like California and Oregon and others have also taken steps in this direction. And the Biden-Harris administration is the presidential administration that has arguably done the most to sound the alarm in terms of problems of exclusionary zoning, but also taking steps to address it through policy action. So the social science literature has, and social science researchers have known about exclusionary zoning for quite a while, and there's quite a bit we have to say about it. Zoning and land use policy is almost exclusively determined at the local municipal level, and this creates incentives for exclusion. The earliest forms of zoning laws were explicitly racial in their intent, and we had examples of explicitly racial zoning laws in the early 20th century in places like Baltimore that basically governed where different races and ethnicities were allowed to live in the city. That got struck down in the Supreme Court case of Buchanan versus Worley in 1917. But planners, you can look through the archival work, and I highly recommend Sonia Hertz, Zoned in the USA, to explore this more. But you can look at archival work to show that planners were very savvy in terms of being able to reinterpret zoning laws to be more about segregating land uses as opposed to explicitly segregating people by race or ethnicity. And many people knew that land uses correlated with socioeconomic and demographic factors. So segregating land uses was another way to explicitly segregate cities by race and class. It's also worth mentioning that zoning and land use it's not that old of an institution, at least in the US. Most cities didn't have any comprehensive zoning until two events. That was the Supreme Court case of Euclid v. Ambler, which essentially enshrined the constitutionality of zoning, and the State Standard Zoning Enabling Act. So a lot of people think of zoning and land use as this sort of sacrosanct right of local governments. But again, most local governments weren't enacting it until the federal government came along with a template zoning document that got essentially replicated after its introduction in 1926. And that was led by then Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover. So zoning becomes much more ubiquitous after the Supreme Court signs off on it, and the federal government essentially gives a playbook for establishing comprehensive zoning. And it's also worth noting that several researchers have pointed out how zoning laws and land use policies became much more exclusionary beginning in the 1970s, very shortly after the passage of the Fair Housing Act. So I walk through all these historical events to show you how exclusionary zoning has sort of evolved throughout the years. And it's a really nimble practice that's been able to be repurposed to continue to basically continue and enshrine residential segregation and segregation by race and class. More recent research has shown how exclusionary zoning correlates with the affluence and the white share of the population of places. So it's a bit of a take on the historical evolution of exclusionary zoning. We have a bunch of empirical evidence that exclusionary zoning inflates housing prices, namely by decreasing the housing supply and making it really hard to build more affordable forms of housing. And this has pretty big downstream effects. So researchers have shown how exclusionary zoning, particularly in the most economically productive parts of the country, reduces economic growth by reducing the incentives to move to a place, because housing costs begin to eat up entire budgets of people who would move to an area. And And as I've mentioned, lots of research showing very clearly how zoning and land use is strongly correlated. I should say restrictive zoning and land use is strongly correlated with racial and class segregation. So we know a lot about exclusionary zoning, but we generally lack longitudinal data on zoning to be able to assess things like cumulative impacts. So what is the cumulative effect of having a really restrictive zoning regime over time? Or if places want to start reforming their zoning and land use procedures, what are the effects of those changes? Not having data over time makes these questions pretty difficult to parse out. And very few of the studies we have on exclusionary zoning investigate those downstream consequences of exclusionary zoning. So housing becomes more expensive in an area, but what might that do to, say, different subpopulations? We have one study on exclusionary zoning's impact on homelessness, finding that it does increase homelessness measured at the state level. We have one study on the relationship between zoning and residential displacement. Basically, more exclusionary zoning is associated with more eviction filings. And we have a few studies looking at spillovers. So what does the zoning in municipality A do to outcomes in, say, neighboring municipality B? But a lot of these studies are basically just looking at housing prices and not other outcomes. But I argue in this research that we'd have good reasons to suspect the most negative consequences of exclusionary zoning in the most disadvantaged areas of metro areas, and particularly in impoverished neighborhoods. There are a few studies that begin to investigate this, but more importantly, we have a lot of social science research showing how residents of the lowest income neighborhoods are the ones who are facing the highest forms of housing precarity. And so we should be especially concerned about these areas when thinking through what are the negative consequences of policies like exclusionary zoning. So with all that background, the research questions are as follows. Does exclusionary zoning aggravate material hardship in impoverished neighborhoods? And if so, what might be some things that are driving this? So that's what I'm going to try to answer in this research. And to do it, I'm drawing on a data set that I created along with my advisor, Matthew Desmond, that essentially compiles zoning and land use information for over 2,600 municipalities across the country. We did this by constructing this data using natural language processing, which I'll get into what that means in a minute. But essentially, we took information from publicly available zoning and land use documents online, and we replicated previously existing data from the 2000s. This is the Wharton Residential Land Use Regulatory Index data. This was data researchers at the University of Pennsylvania essentially mailed out surveys to municipal officials all over the country, and the responses they got back on a bunch of zoning and land use indicators formed this data. This is probably the most commonly used form of zoning and land use data. There's another one commissioned and now maintained by the Urban Institute that is very similar. And so we basically took the measures captured in those data and replicated them for the current time period using different methods. We didn't survey municipal officials. We just took regulations right from the zoning documents themselves to build the data that we'll use for this study. It's called the National Zoning and Land Use Database. It's available at the Eviction Lab. When you navigate to it, it will send you to my GitHub page, which is where the data exists. And I believe that link has been shared with all attendees. But a little bit more on the data, which is publicly available. We argue that this data overcomes limitations of these past zoning survey data. One, because it's less costly. We now have the tool to build zoning data moving forward, so there's no need to commission lengthy and time-intensive surveys to get this really important information. And in that sense, it's more efficient too. If you have access to the text of zoning documents, you can feed it into the computer program that we built, and you can have zoning measures in a matter of minutes. And in many cases, it's more accurate. We're pulling information directly from the regulations themselves, not asking municipal officials to interpret them in sometimes in subjective ways. So the data is available, and also the code that built it. So that makes this the most open source database on zoning and land use out there. Users can access this to scale it to any municipality that publishes its codes online or makes them available publicly. It can be replicated regularly to have longitudinal information moving forward. And it can be expanded to any zoning and land use measure you care about. So we capture a lot that I'll get into in a minute, but not everything. And there's many, many zoning and land use policies that are important to consider. Because these resources are publicly available, nothing's stopping anybody from using this to promote further research, advocacy efforts, so on and so forth. So the sky's really the limit with this tool, and we're really just getting started with this. Okay, so I'll walk through a little bit of how this data is created and then get into the analysis and some results. So first and foremost, we download a bunch of zoning and land use documents, a little over 2,600. Then we have to go through and make sure that there's actually zoning and land use information in those documents. There are instances in which municipalities do redact their zoning and land use information, so there's nothing for us to parse if they're not in the documents. But again, we get about a little over 2,600. And then there are a set of pre-processing steps to basically standardize information in these documents. So certain keywords can appear in a variety of ways. The computer program basically just makes them similar so that it's easier to capture. We filter out unnecessary words or punctuation marks, things like that make the processing a little more difficult. And then we standardize the numeric information. So lot size information can be stored as acres or square feet, or really in like numeric terms and tables. The computer program is built to be able to account for all of that. And then we use these natural language processing methods, which I'll get to in the next few slides, to capture all these zoning and land use measures. And then we take all of these measures, and what this step 5 is basically saying is combining all of those measures into one summary measure that's essentially a measure of how exclusionary a place's zoning and land use policies are. And that's what we'll be looking at a little bit later on. But to give you a sense of like what's actually going on here, I'll just walk through what the computer program is essentially doing. So this is an excerpt from Washington, D.C.'s zoning code. Let's say we cared about figuring out information about a minimum lot area or minimum lot size. You can think of it that way. If we wanted to just know if this municipality has this regulation on the books, what the program does is it locks onto that keyword, and then it's going to search the surrounding context in the text for other keywords. And each keyword it searched for has a weight. So in this case, the keywords that it finds in the surrounding context of this table are minimum, lot area, and shall be. Minimum has a weight of 3. Lot area has a weight of 2. Shall be has a weight of 1. The way this computer program works is if all of the keywords captured, if their weights sum to over 5, that tells the computer program that, yep, this regulation exists, and it moves on to the next regulation. So that's what's happening here. Because this criteria is met, this tells us that Washington, D.C. has a minimum lot size regulation, and then it'll move on to the next one. But again, like zoning codes come in all varieties, and this information can be stored in a bunch of different ways. This is an excerpt from Princeton, New Jersey's zoning code. So similar information can just be stated in text. So here, this is a single family residential district where the lot area per dwelling unit, essentially the minimum lot area, is 20,000 square feet. The computer program is going to be able to capture this based on those methods I just mentioned. And then information can be stored in tables. So this is Milwaukee's zoning code. And a lot of Milwaukee's zoning information is stored in tables like this, but the computer program is built to be able to capture, like hone in on this keyword and extract the information, the relevant information in these rows and columns. So When we got started on this research, the Wharton researchers published an updated survey wave in which 874 municipalities that were in that original sample from the 2000s were in this updated survey, which means we have 874 municipalities in both our data and this updated data, which was essentially run at the same time. So we have a really convenient set of municipalities to compare the output of this natural language processing method to see, are we even measuring the same thing? Like, how close do we get? As you can see, these are the share of matching values across the same municipalities. And we have a pretty high degree of matching for a lot of these. Of course, some are harder to replicate than others. These are really complex things to capture from the zoning documents, but we do a pretty good job based on our first attempt here. And these measures give you a sense of what's being combined to calculate, the overall restrictiveness of a municipality. So it's things like, does a municipality restrict the amount of permits it issues in a given year, or literally limit the amount of units it'll allow in a year? Are there minimum lot sizes? If so, how stringent are they? Larger minimum lot sizes would basically mandate larger and more expensive forms of housing. Are there open space requirements, and how how do those interact with exclusionary zoning? How many governing bodies need to sign off on development in order for it to move forward? These sorts of things. And the data we get from the updated Urban Institute data also feed into this. So does a municipality have inclusionary zoning programs? What are the maximum amount of units per acre that it permits in the municipality? So on and so forth. And again, we have pretty good matching rates on a lot of these measures, which just gives us confidence that this procedure is working as intended. So to get to the analysis, what I do is, to have data for the last 20 years, I basically combine these survey data, which come from the early 2000s, and then the data that I created and just walked through with you. So I combine these to give me 2 time periods of data, which span from basically 2003, 2004 to 2022. It's the largest database on zoning and land use out there, and it gives us data for about 2,600 municipalities again. So in the first time period, again, that information is coming from zoning survey data, and we're pulling outcomes from census information, essentially. And the time period 2 data is coming from our National Zoning and Land Use database. We're also getting data from the Census American Community Survey estimates for these given time ranges. I can get into this later, but all this is to say there's a lot of missing values in the time period 1 data, that zoning survey information. I use a process called multiple imputation to account for that, and I run checks to make sure that that's not driving the results. If anyone wants to talk about that afterwards, we can, but I just wanted to note that as part of the methodology. So this is what that final index looks like. It's standardized. So basically the mean of this distribution, so the average restrictiveness is 0. Below average restrictive municipalities are going to have negative scores. Above average are going to have positive scores. So the way to interpret this is basically, if a municipality has higher levels on this index, that's indicating that it's a more exclusionary municipality. And I'll show some maps in a little bit to help you make a little bit more sense of this. Now, it's worth mentioning that these underlying data are relying on samples of municipalities. We don't have data on the entire country. And in many cases, we're missing fairly significant amounts of metro areas. So what these stats are showing you is, on average, we're capturing about 19% of municipalities in a given metro area in the first time period. In the second time period, we're capturing on average about 21% of municipalities, but we are capturing the more populated ones and the ones that are growing more. So that 19% of municipalities captured accounts for about 43% of the metro area in the first time period. For those same set of municipalities in the second time period, it's capturing about 58% of the overall metro area population. So we're not capturing all municipalities in all cases. or the entire population, but we are capturing places where there is a significant amount of the population in most metropolitan areas. The analyses I'm going to show you are at 2 levels. So the MSA level you can think of as the metro area. So, for Milwaukee's purposes, the entire Milwaukee metro area. In this case, the treatment variable that I care about, the one that we're going to focus on, is this exclusionary zoning index. I'm taking not just the average level in a metro area, but I'm also accounting for the extent to which there are gaps from the central city to the most exclusively zoned suburban municipality. So this is going to pick up on whether or not in a metro area there are really permissively zoned central cities where it's fairly easy to build affordable housing, but really, really difficult to do it in the suburban areas. The outcomes that I'm going to show you in a minute are what is the median gross rent of a neighborhood, the share of households experiencing rent burden, so households spending more than 30% of their monthly income on rent, and the median property values in these neighborhoods. And these are going to be specific neighborhoods of a given poverty rate or a geographic distinction. And I'll explain what I mean by that in the next few slides. There's one outcome at the metro level that I'll show, and that is, of all housing units in a metro area, what share of them are affordable to households that are earning below median incomes. And I account for a bunch of other things in the model, like the population, the homeownership rate, the poverty rate. All of these variables are at the MSA level, and they're coming again from census information. Now, I do this same exact thing at the municipal level. So this should look very similar, except at the municipal level, I'm not just taking a municipality's ZRI score. I'm also taking the median of its neighbors in a 10-mile radius. So what we're accounting for is not just the zoning restrictiveness of a given city, we're also going to account for its neighbors to capture that spatial information, to account for the fact that the zoning of neighbors in a given area is going to also impact these sorts of things. But it's the same outcomes, again, in these neighborhoods aggregated to the municipal level, and the same exact factors, just now at the municipal or city level. Just a word on the models I use to account for this thing called post-treatment bias. So in this diagram, this is illustrating a problem that I try to account for in my statistical models. The ZRI is the zoning restrictiveness index. You can think of that as treatment. This is showing that in this model, what I'm allowing for is past levels of zoning restrictiveness to impact future levels of zoning restrictiveness. We have good reason to suspect that's the case, but also what zoning was in the past could probably impact the social and demographic and socioeconomic profile of places. And then that can in turn impact what zoning and land use looks like in that time period. And so we want to be able to account for this and make sure it's not biasing the results that we get in our analyses. I do that through something that's called a marginal structural model. This is probably more information than any viewers need, so we can get into it afterwards or offline if anyone's interested. But essentially, it's a way of accounting for this problem that I illustrated in the past diagram. It estimates the probability that a place has exclusionary zoning, and then using those predicted probabilities, it essentially reweights the data to make exclusionary and non-exclusionary places similar on all things we can observe in census data. And then that isolates the role of exclusionary zoning in these outcomes I'm going to show you. So it's a way of really honing in on what is exactly the association of exclusionary zoning and not, say, poverty or some other factor that might be explaining these relationships. Okay, so enough with the methods. Let's go into some of what the data looks like and then some results. So I'm going to show you some maps that are using information from the Zoning Restrictiveness Index. And what these maps are color-coded. So each municipality that has a color has information about zoning and land use information. And what's being mapped here are the zoning restrictiveness index. So cities that have green, dark green or light green are fairly permissively zoned. They're below average restrictive. A municipality with yellow is roughly average. And then municipalities that are orange or red are getting into the more restrictive municipalities. If a municipality has no shading, that's because we're missing information on it. It's not included in the data. This is the Trenton-Princeton metro area. This is where I lived for most of my graduate studies. And it's a pretty exclusionary metro area, one of the most in the country. So this registers as above average. The central city here, Trenton, is majority people of color. It's very impoverished, and it's surrounded by a ring of suburban municipalities that are far more affluent and far more restrictive. And this maps on to very high levels of residential segregation. It's one of the most residentially segregated metro areas in the country, and it's the most economically segregated metro area in the country. So this is an example of where exclusionary zoning is very much going hand in hand with other, high levels of segregation on multiple dimensions. But, this is a metro area that's close to New York. It's more or less coastal. This might be something this might be a place we would expect exclusionary zoning, but there are also examples of above average restrictive MSAs like Milwaukee that might not be commonly referred to as places where exclusionary zoning is present. Milwaukee here is a metro area a little bit different than Princeton and Trenton, where the central city is more or less averagely zoned, average restrictive levels, but there are instances of suburban municipalities with high levels of restrictiveness, which is being captured in this measure and puts this as an above average metro area in terms of zoning restrictiveness. And again, Milwaukee is a metro area where there are very high levels of residential segregation, some of the highest in the country, very high levels of income segregation, so on and so forth. Now, for some examples of below average restrictive metro areas, one is the San Antonio metro area. This is one in which, at least in our data, the central city registers as fairly restrictive, but there are suburban municipalities that have pretty permissive amounts of zoning and land use measures. And so this is not exactly capturing those really restrictive suburban municipalities relative to the central city. There's also places, metro areas like Pittsburgh, where there aren't many examples of restrictively zoned suburbs, and the central city itself also is not super restrictively zoned. So this is another example of a below average restrictive MSA in this data. I think the Pittsburgh metro area illustrates the problem of missing municipalities pretty more than the other examples. I mean, this is a limitation of the previous data that we're replicating. There is a fair degree of missingness, but we have plans to address that moving forward. Okay, so now getting to the results. What I'm going to show you are the associations between these exclusionary zoning indicators and the outcomes that I mentioned a few slides ago. And what you're seeing here are 95% confidence intervals. So the way to interpret this is if this estimate is above, and I will direct your attention to the blue models. We can get into what the other models are later on if anyone's interested, but these blue models correspond to those marginal structural models. And this is the association we care about. If these confidence intervals do not overlap with 0, that's telling us at 95% confidence, we have a statistically significant association. So in other words, what you're seeing here are the results for the association between exclusionary zoning at the metro level and monthly median gross rents in 3 different kinds of neighborhoods. In this first column, we have neighborhoods that have above average levels of poverty. So roughly 13% or more households are living above under the poverty level. In this second, these are high poverty neighborhoods. So neighborhoods where 40% or more of households are under the poverty level. And then this final quadrant are high poverty neighborhoods in central cities. So you can think of these as the high poverty neighborhoods of Milwaukee or Chicago or the central cities of metro areas. These confidence intervals get wider the further we go to the right, because as you notice, we just get fewer and fewer metro areas that meet these criteria. So we have fewer observations to calculate these associations, and we just have lower levels of confidence. So these are overlapping with 0. But in this case, the takeaway from this slide is in above average poverty neighborhoods of restrictively zoned metro areas, monthly median gross rent in these neighborhoods is $54 higher every month in these neighborhoods. So to put it another way, a renter in an above average poverty neighborhood is facing higher median rents in a above average restrictive metro area relative to a renter in a very similar above average poverty neighborhood, but in a place of the country where there's less restrictive zoning. So this is evidence that this restrictive zoning is associated with higher housing costs in impoverished neighborhoods. And when we look at this at the municipal level, so the city level, the associations are even more pronounced. So in these above average poverty neighborhoods, monthly median gross rents are $92 higher in areas of more restrictive zoning, even in high poverty neighborhoods where 40% or more of households are under the poverty level. We see housing costs up by $65, and these are monthly rents. So these are meaningful increases in rents that are going to very much disadvantage the already disadvantaged neighborhoods of these metro areas just because they're located in metro areas where there's and areas of these metro areas where there's restrictive zoning. We can also look at what is the share of rent burden households in these neighborhoods. So again, this is at the metro level now. About 1%, the amount of households, or I should say the share of households in above average poverty neighborhoods where folks are spending more than 30% of their income on monthly rent is about a percentage point higher in these areas of exclusionary zoning. And when we look at the city level, so we're going down a little bit, this is true across all of these contexts. So the share of rent burden households increases by about 1.5 percentage points across all of these neighborhood designations in areas of restrictive zoning. So those were the two main outcomes that I wanted to show you, and now to look at what might be possible reasons for these increases in material hardship. One is the fact that median property values are higher in these places. And so again, looking at places in above average poverty neighborhoods of restrictive areas, property values are about $25,000 higher in each period in these areas, which you can think of as a way of housing costs getting passed on to renters. So if property owners are facing higher property values and property costs, if they operate rental units, those are very likely being passed on to renters in the form of increased rent. If we look at the municipal level, again, same sort of pattern. These associations are even more pronounced. So in above average poverty neighborhoods of restrictive areas, median property values are close to $50,000 higher. In high poverty contexts, around $35,000 higher in each period. So for the final set of results to look at, one other possible mechanism here is that the share of housing units in a metro area that are affordable to below median income earners are just declining over time. So these are three different contexts. ELI refers to extremely low income households. Those are households making 30% of the national median income. VLI is very low income. These folks are making 50% of the national median income, and then low income refers to 80% of the national median income. And for very low income and low income households, the supply of units, or just the share of units in a metro area that are affordable to them if they weren't rent burdened, is decreasing over time by about 3 to 4 percentage points in each period, which is a pretty significant decline. And again, this is just due to restrictive zoning and land use policies in these areas. So I'll end with some concluding thoughts, and then we can open it up to questions and comments from the group. But just to leave you with some takeaways. So what I believe this research shows is that exclusionary zoning is likely disadvantaging renting households in impoverished neighborhoods. We saw that median gross rent and the proportion of rent burden households is systematically higher in these neighborhoods of more exclusionary areas. And this is possibly happening through the fact that median property values are increasing in these areas. Housing costs in general are going up. And also, there's just fewer and fewer housing units affordable to households of more modest means in these metro areas. There's just fewer and fewer options. And landlords are going to be able to take advantage of this shrinking supply of more affordable housing to make housing just more difficult to access, particularly for low-income households in these areas. Some implications. So one of the common narratives of exclusionary zoning is that it makes it really hard to access, say, low poverty contexts. And that's a primary way in which it enshrines residential segregation, given how our history of racist housing policy has intertwined race and class. It's a very obvious way of how you maintain class segregation if you literally can't afford to live in a more expensive area. But this research goes one step further in making a case that the zoning and land use of neighboring municipalities can also impact the housing costs and the material hardship experienced by neighboring municipalities. And that's regardless of people's mobility intentions. So this research is suggesting that renters in impoverished neighborhoods where exclusionary zoning is really salient and present are being disadvantaged by higher housing costs and just more material hardship, just simply by the fact of being in that area. And these are people potentially suffering these consequences that have no standing to change the rules in other municipalities, or in some cases, neighborhoods across town. I would argue that these results give some empirical support to the idea that zoning authority and fair housing reform should be considered to rein in these potentially negative externalities that are happening across space. And one other thing to note is that this research should make the case that housing policy is directly relevant to the issue of housing unaffordability, even in high poverty MSAs. This might be a self-evident statement, but another narrative in the housing policy literature is that, well, exclusionary zoning is a problem in San Francisco and New York and the coastal housing markets, but it's not really a problem anywhere else. This research pushes back on that a bit because I think anyone anywhere in the country can think of places that protest affordable housing, make it really hard to build housing, period. If that's such a salient thing that so many people in the country understand, that's because it's being done through zoning and land use policy. And while it's true that places like Milwaukee and its metro area have lower housing costs relative to San Francisco or New York, it's still true that there are, within the Milwaukee metro area, it's harder to access given neighborhoods and given municipalities because there are price differentials across space. And that's important to consider when studying zoning and land use. So the idea is we need to go after restrictive zoning and do our best to reform it in places where it exists, not just in the areas where there's the highest housing demand or housing costs. And I think this research is giving us some reason to take that into consideration. Last thing I'll say is that I think there's really exciting related work that's being done by one of my colleagues, Unsung Yoon, also at the Eviction Lab. She's a postdoctoral researcher. She's doing ongoing research that's found evidence of algorithmic price setting by landlords that have flooded markets like Milwaukee and elsewhere in the country, especially in the high end of the housing market, which is suggesting that prices in these ends of the markets are increasing, which can then have downstream effects about where people locate and housing costs spilling over into other neighborhoods. And it's worth noting that all of this is happening regardless of, well, to say it another way, doing nothing about zoning and land use doesn't prevent these kinds of things that then compound housing inequity. So this is an example of how exclusionary zoning is something that should be considered alongside other known problems in the housing market and things that we need to address to build equity and to build housing stability for all. I have some ideas about where we might go with the zoning data if we want to talk about that, but I've talked for enough. So I'll end by acknowledging our generous funders and thanking 1,000 Friends of Wisconsin and you all again for being here. I really appreciate being able to share this, and I'm eager to hear any questions or thoughts or comments you might have. So I'll turn over the floor.
Thank you so much for sharing your research, talking about all the methods that you use. This is a reminder that if you've got a question, you can put it in chat. Obviously, we only have a little bit of time here, so if you've got a question, we can always try to also address it later. So I'm going to actually kick off with the first question. You talked about looking at it over time. Was there also a consideration of what the effects are as zoning changes over time? Can you like really drill down into the data that far as basically like exclusionary zoning is an issue when it's removed or lessened? Do we see, what are the impacts that we see?
Sure. Yeah, good question. Thanks, Carl. For this study, I was really interested in what are the cumulative impacts of zoning just over time. And so that's getting at a different question. It's something we can do with the data. One thing to note is Milwaukee's a good example of this. A lot of places have yet to change those zoning codes in ways that we would expect to have impacts. And even when they do, it takes several years for those potential impacts to be even seen in the data and experienced. And places have only, like Minneapolis, Oregon, California, there are others in the country, have only recently started these reforms. And so it may take a few years to see this. But the good thing with this data we've created is if we replicate this and continue to measure it moving forward into those years, absolutely, that's something that this data enables, and we can measure that and then measure the effectiveness of given zoning reforms. There are places, and I'll note quickly, there are places in different parts of the world that have been able to start estimating the benefits of zoning reform. The one that comes to mind is actually Auckland, New Zealand. For anyone who wants to look that up, Rio de Janeiro is another. There are good examples internationally, not so much in the U.S. so far, but maybe in a few years we'll have the results of those as well.
We do have some questions in the chat, so I'm just going to go in order. The first is from Montavious. Hi, Montavious. We're glad you're here. Can housing prices in nearby neighborhoods also increase cost in impoverished neighborhoods, not just nearby municipalities?
Yeah, I think so. I can't show that here because of the level of the data I'm using. So the lowest level of aggregation is the municipal level in terms of the zoning policies. But in theory, yeah, if you had data at the district level, you could then estimate, basically do a very similar study across neighborhoods instead of across cities in a metro area. So I think that's exactly right. And that's the direction I hope to go with as we make improvements to the data. So I appreciate you bringing that up, Montavious. It's a good one.
I think this is a really good follow-up to that. Karen from Grave says, you mentioned price differentials across Milwaukee. Is that possible to break that down by census tract or neighborhood or zoning district and analyze with further research? And if yes, would that help planners here target specific zoning designations?
Yes, I think so. I appreciate the question. The easiest way that I know of to do it is to pick some housing cost indicator and census data. That can be median property value. That could be median gross rent. And you could look at municipality by municipality. You could even look at neighborhoods, like census tracts in different areas of the metro area, or even just Milwaukee. But for sure, there are, I use the example of Brookfield and Washington Heights in Milwaukee. But if you look, like housing costs and demographics are much different in those areas and neighborhoods relative to, say, the Milwaukee metro area or the city of Milwaukee. And so that's definitely possible to do. Tools like Social Explorer make it much more user-friendly. But if there are questions out there about how to go about doing that, please send me an email, contact me. I'd be happy to talk further about how to facilitate that.
I think we're going to do at least one more because this is really important. Jennifer, and I know this is near and dear to you. As an elected official, this topic makes many people defensive. How can we shape the narrative to overcome known resistance?
It's a great question. It's one I think about all the time. In addition to the research I do, I've gotten very involved. When I was living in Princeton, New Jersey, I was an active attendee at a lot of zoning and planning board meetings. And there is defensiveness, but I think there are a lot of misconceptions from very well-meaning people as well. And that's one where research can help sort of reshape the narrative about what we know about the effects of these policies. Also, what we know, at least anecdotally, about the impact of zoning reforms. So I always like to reference a meeting I was at. So a couple of years ago, Princeton changed zoning in a particular neighborhood to allow for multifamily housing. And there were many concerns about what it might do to traffic, school capacity, so on and so forth. A couple of years later, this was a different, entirely different meeting about an entirely different zoning change to allow affordable housing. And one of the residents from that neighborhood attended the meeting and said, a couple of years ago, I came and I testified against that housing development because I thought it was, going to increase traffic and lead to all these things that didn't happen. And it's actually, our neighborhood's better for it. And so I want to come here and support this because I think it's a great thing. So being able to capture those kinds of changes of heart, for lack of a better term, I think is important, but also projecting a positive narrative about, these are at the end of the day, arbitrary rules we're talking about that can be changed overnight. And if we do it in an effective way, it can improve livability, affordability, equity for everyone involved. And I think framing it that way is important to build a broad coalition to build the political will for change. And there are places doing that. Minneapolis to Milwaukee's west is an example of a city that figured that out. It's not perfect. There's still contention and there's still debates, but I think there is an argument that can win the day. And so if folks want examples of those two and want to think through that with me, I'd be happy to talk further about that too.
Well, thank you so much again, Matt, for coming and sharing, presenting your research with us. And thank you everyone for attending today. Again, if you end up having other questions or thoughts, feel free to reach out to me or to Susan, and we can facilitate an ongoing conversation. We will also be doing 1,000 Friends of Wisconsin will be doing a housing forum on September 18th here in Milwaukee. We'll send out more details about that soon. So this is definitely a continued conversation that we want to have. So thank you again. And also we'll send out the recording after. So have a great day.